Good afternoon and Happy New Year, and also welcome to our first Real Talk economic session of 2025. My name is Markus Kuger and I'm the Chief Economic Advisor at Baker Ring. We are a global accounts receivables management company. The new year has started, but unfortunately the old problems didn't go away. We're still in a period of very weak growth. Donald Trump will return to the White House next week. That will cause some problems on the geopolitical front. And then credit risk is also still a source of concern. I want to start today's presentation with macroeconomic trends. If you had joined us in December, you might remember that the global economy wasn't in great shape. Unfortunately, data series haven't really improved over the past few weeks since we last met. There's still a lot of underwhelming developments. We will talk about business confidence. We'll talk about consumer confidence. There are a few outliers. Inflation is one of them, but generally speaking, the macroeconomic conditions are not supportive for businesses. Second chapter of today will be geopolitical developments. As said, that will be dominated by the return of Donald Trump. And the last chapter of today, before we reach the Q&A session, is credit risk. We will have a look at B2B payments performance data in Europe, as well as business failure stats. We want to make this as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, please use the comments function here in the LinkedIn Live event. That should pull through, so I will be able to see them. Some of you have already submitted questions, and I said I have set aside a bit of time towards the end of today's live event. So let's start with macroeconomic conditions. Let's start with business confidence, and let's look at the US first. The US is probably the geography where business confidence is looking the most solid, but even there are certain areas that are concerning. When we look at the composite output index, PMI, composite output index, PMI standing for Purchasing Managers Index data, the picture doesn't look too bad, actually. One word about the PMI methodology: 50 is a neutral line. Everything between 0 and 50 is bad, contracting, pessimism. Everything above 50 to theoretically 100, which is the best possible reading, means survey respondents are optimistic and the sector is growing. So 50 is neutral, everything below 50 is bad, everything above 50 is good. PMI composite output index, composite meaning combination of services and manufacturing, stands at 56.6 points in the US, and that is actually the highest reading in 33 months. So fairly solid. However, when we drill down, we will actually see that this is only driven by services. In the service sector, the output index stands at 58.5 points, so very comfortably above 50. In manufacturing, it stands at 46 points, so below 50, and actually the worst reading in 55 months. And that is the biggest gap between services and manufacturing ever recorded in the US. When we look at output expectations, so survey respondents are asked, how do you feel about the next 12 months? That is actually on the best reading in 2.5 years. But again, that is driven by the service sector, not by manufacturing companies. New order inflow has risen in the service sector, actually by the highest pace since March 2022, but in manufacturing, it has been falling for half a year now. So in the service sector, best reading since March 2022. In manufacturing, down for 6 months in a row. That gives you a rough idea about the state of the American economy, service sector, businesses more upbeat, much more upbeat than manufacturing. And that is a common theme across the globe. Because we can also see that in Asia. Here we're looking at a slightly different way of approaching PMIs. We're looking at 3 very important sub-indices. The blue bar represents the output index, Orange represents new order inflow, and the purple bar represents the employment sub-index. Same methodology, readings below 50 are bad, readings above 50 are good. When we look at output growth in Asia, we're seeing that 11 out of 18 sectors reported output growth in December. Not that bad, especially when we look at Europe. We will do that in a minute. But the December reading is actually worse than the November reading. In November, we still had 15 sectors that reported output growth. Now it's down to 11. When we look at new order inflow, 13 out of 18 sectors reported new order growth. Again, a fairly good reading compared with Europe. When we look at the biggest economy in the region, which is China, we see that split again between manufacturing and the service sector. Manufacturing PMI in China stands at 50.5 points in December, so just above 50, just above that neutral line. And that is actually down from 51.5 points in November. Service sector is up, was 51.5 points in November, now went up to 52.2 points. That is the best reading in 7 months. And in the Chinese service sector, the PMI has been above that neutral 50 points line for 2 years in a row now. But again, manufacturing is weaker than services. That is that common theme that we are seeing across the globe. In China, at least the good news is that both PMIs are in growth territory, just in growth territory, just above 50, but nonetheless in growth territory. So let's have a look at Europe. And the picture gets much bleaker now. Same logic as in Asia. We're looking at 3 PMI sub-indices here. Blue is output, orange new order inflow, and purple is employment. And we are looking at that data for 20 sectors that are covered in that European publication. In Europe, only 9 sectors reported output growth in December. New orders fell in 12 out of these 20 sectors, and employment increased in 5 out of 20 sectors. So in other words, output growth down, new order inflow down, employment down. Not a great start of the year. And when you look at the different sectors, you can see that the manufacturing sectors, especially automotive, they are struggling. We are seeing this split between services and manufacturing in Europe, like we did in the US, like we did in Asia. When we look at the service sector PMI in the Eurozone, we can see that positively that jumped above that neutral line again. It's now on 51.6 points. That is good news, but it's not far away, much weaker than in the US. And in manufacturing, the PMI stands at 45.2 points, which is actually the worst reading in 3 months. Looking at the UK, very, very similar picture here. UK manufacturing PMI, 47 points, so below the growth threshold in contraction territory. And this is actually the worst reading in almost a year, the lowest reading in 11 months, in fact. Similar to that European picture, new order inflow in the UK is down, output growth is down, and employment's down when we look at the manufacturing sector. Service sector picture slightly better, 51.1 point. So that is slightly up from November. It is in growth territory. But if we were combining October, November, December reading, so if we were to create a quarterly reading, that would actually be the worst reading in 1 year. In the service sector, new order inflow is stagnating, and that is actually the worst reading since October 2023. Employment in the service sector, at least that's what PMI survey respondents are saying, is down, and it's down by the fastest pace since January 2021. And that was obviously distorted by COVID lockdowns. So why is that? It could have something to do with the autumn budget announcements. National insurance contributions will go up in the UK, will go up in April, hasn't happened yet. But obviously it is having an impact on sentiment, on the willingness to take on new workers already. So business confidence not looking that great, especially in manufacturing. When we look at consumer confidence, the picture is slightly better here on the left-hand side. You see the consumer confidence index that is compiled by the OECD. This is a global chart, so it's aggregating national readings. If I was showing you the UK consumer confidence index, would be a very similar movement. There were all-time lows in 2022. Consumers had never been so pessimistic as in 2022, not even during COVID, not even during the global financial crisis. That cost of living crisis in 2022 was having a very, very severe impact on consumer confidence around the globe, including the UK. And luckily, that cost of living crisis, I wouldn't say has ended, but it's certainly not as severe as it was. Inflation has come down again. Interest rates were cut. Wage growth was fairly robust. So consumers are less pessimistic than they were a year ago, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. The problem is, well, there are two problems. Problem number one is that this process is coming to a halt now. It's slowing down. In fact, in the UK, we had seen deteriorations in September and October around the autumn budget. So that quick improvement that we've seen in 2023 and in the first half of 2024, that isn't happening anymore, at least not in the UK. And the much bigger problem is that although consumer confidence has risen, it hasn't really had an impact on consumers' willingness to spend. In fact, savings rates, household savings rates in Europe have risen to a new all-time high if you ignore COVID. COVID obviously had an impact on the ability to save. You couldn't go on holiday. You couldn't spend it on restaurants. You couldn't spend it on cinema visits. So there was a lot of disposable income, and a lot of that was saved. But if you ignore this COVID anomaly, savings rates are now on an all-time high. Why is that? It's because households are concerned. It's called precautionary savings. Households are concerned that they might lose their job. So they're holding on to their money. They're not spending it, which is not good news for every company that is selling to the consumer market. So consumer confidence is rising, but yeah, the willingness to spend isn't moving in sync to that. In fact, households are saving more than they were before COVID. It's a new all-time high. There are a few positive stories, and one of them is certainly inflation. Inflation has moderated tremendously over the last 2 years. And again, this is a global phenomenon, as you can see here on the left-hand side in the chart. These are figures for advanced economies as well as emerging markets. You can see that they're pretty much moving in sync. Inflation has fallen a lot and isn't expected to pick up again. Why has inflation come down? Several reasons. Commodity prices have fallen. There were base effects at play. Growth wasn't particularly good, which isn't a positive story, but it certainly helps with inflation. And then the medicine that was prescribed by central bankers was bitter, but it worked. Interest rates increased, which in turn had a positive effect on inflation. However, there is still a massive gap between service sector inflation and goods inflation. For example, in the Eurozone, service sector inflation at the moment stands at 4%. Goods inflation stands at 0.5%. So service sector inflation is 8 times higher than goods inflation. It's much more persistent in the service sector, and that is a source of concern. There's a lot of stickiness, which is rather worrying. Positively, in many developed economies, central bank targets have been reached again. Central banks' targets often are around 2%. At the bottom, you can see the most recent figures. UK is actually a bit lower now. The Bank of England released, or the ONS released new data this morning. UK inflation is now on 2.5%. It was a bit of an unexpected fall. And that is pretty much in line with what we're seeing in the Eurozone. And in the US, it's a bit above 2%. It has actually gone down over the past few months. But nonetheless, we're far away from these 9%, 10% inflation rates that we saw in 2022. When we look at the labor market, that's also an indicator where we can't see any weakness at the moment, at least when we look at unemployment rates. Unemployment has been falling in most countries. In fact, in the Eurozone, it's on an all-time low, 6.3% in November, the lowest reading ever recorded. And especially in Central Europe, full employment has been reached. So in Poland, in Czech Republic, in Hungary, unemployment stands at or even below 3%, and 3% for us economists is full employment being reached. In the UK, unemployment has gone up a bit, but not by much, and it's still very, very low. In the UK, the most recent data point is 4.3% unemployment. So labor market still looking solid. That doesn't mean that there are no signs of weaknesses in the labor market. In fact, some slowdown readings can be visible or are clearly visible, and one of them is vacancies. So job vacancy rates have dropped. We're looking at the readings for the Eurozone as well as the EU here. That's data from Eurostat. You can see that drop during COVID. Obviously, nobody was willing to hire someone during that phase. And then we've seen a steep increase until 2022, 2023. And since then, figures have been falling again. And it's much more visible actually in UK data. This is job vacancies in the UK. And we see a massive drop during the lockdowns. And then job vacancies rose to a new all-time high of around 1.3 million in 2022, 2023. And since then, figures have been falling for 29 months in a row now. We're pretty much back to where we were before COVID. So there's still a tightness in the labor market, but the willingness of companies to hire new workers, to create new jobs, that has certainly gone down over the last 2.5 years. Not only in the UK, this is a European phenomenon. It hasn't translated into the unemployment rate yet, but we are clearly seeing a drop in job vacancies, and eventually it will impact on the unemployment rate as well. We're also seeing wage growth moderating. Here we are looking at EU and Eurozone data. Not a lot of differences here. We see a massive drop during COVID. Obviously, COVID wasn't the time to ask for pay rise. And then we see massive increases after COVID, coinciding with that increase in job vacancies, but obviously also coinciding with super high inflation rates. Now with inflation having moved lower again, nominal wages are also starting to, well, not fall, but growth is easing. We're seeing a similar development here in the UK, but as you can also see here, there's a difference between nominal wage growth and real wage growth. Real wage growth factors in the inflation rate, and in real terms, wages are still looking okay. Nominal wage growth is not as strong as it was a year ago or 2 years ago, but because inflation is going down as well, that helps with the purchasing power of that new salary packet. So wages are still, I'd say, looking okayish from a domestic consumption point of view, but households are not spending it. They're putting it into the bank account effectively to save up. So let's have a look at the most important economic indicator there is. That is real GDP growth. And here you can see growth projections from the IMF's latest World Economic Outlook. And as you can see, global growth in 2025 will be around 3.2%, according to the International Monetary Fund. That is pretty much unchanged from 2024 and 2023. For 2026, for example, the World Bank has already released a 2026 forecast. The World Bank expects global growth in 2026 to be around 3.3%. So in other words, the global economy has been moving sideways for 4 years, should these forecasts materialize. The differential between advanced economies and emerging markets is rather small. Normally it's bigger. Normally emerging markets grow much faster than advanced economies. The gap is unusually small. When we look at a few key markets, we can see, well, not a lot of news or positive news here. At least US growth, according to the IMF, will slow down to 2.2% this year, down from 2.8% last year. Euro area growth will accelerate next year. That's the good news. The bad news is that it will accelerate from 0.8% estimated, because we obviously still haven't seen Q4 data for most countries. It will accelerate from 0.8% to 1.2%. So it will grow faster. Eurozone GDP will go up, but a very anemic growth rate, I have to say. Similar picture in the UK, from 1.1% in 2024 to 1.5% next year. Germany, for example, is one of the countries that has already released Q4 data for 2024 this morning, which obviously enables the statistics office to calculate the overall 2024 growth rate. And the IMF had forecasted a stagnation, zero growth in Germany in 2024. However, the data that was released this morning actually shows that the German economy has shrunk again, has shrunk by 0.2% in 2024, which makes it a second year of contraction. And given how things stand, there's a fairly sizable chance that the German economy will shrink again in 2025. And I will come to that in a second, why that is. And if Germany's economy will shrink in 2025 as well, that would make it a 3-year contraction, which is unprecedented in peacetime history. China isn't on the table. Just a word about China, as it is the world's second biggest economy. Slowdown there as well, from an already low 4.8% last year to a forecasted 4.5% in 2025. Things look a bit better in India, which is a new poster boy, given its high growth rate. But even in India, growth will slow down. The IMF estimates 6.8% growth for 2024, and from 6.8%, it will drop to 6.5%. There's one big problem with this set of forecasts, and that is that these forecasts were created in October. In other words, they are from pre-Trump victory days. So Trump's return to the White House hasn't been priced in, and a lot of forecasters have actually revised growth forecasts downwards since Donald Trump won the election. I think that is the right thing to do. The IMF will publish a new set of forecasts next week or the week after. So by the end of January, we will know what the impact of Donald Trump's victory on global growth as well as national growth will be. And Germany is one of the most exposed countries. We will come to that when we assess exposure risk to the US in a few minutes' time. So the original forecast from October was already very gloomy, and with Donald Trump returning to the White House, I'd expect some downward revisions to these already disappointing figures over the next few weeks. So that brings us to the next chapter, geopolitical developments. And yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty in the UK, in the US, and in the EU. So not a lot of good news here as well. 2024 was a very, very important year in terms of politics, because half of the global population elected a new president and or a new parliament. And generally speaking, the rise of anti-establishment, quite often far-right parties, not always, but quite often far-right parties and candidates has continued. And that has led to fragmented parliaments, which in turn has complicated the formation of governments. Coalition building is much trickier than it was. And even in countries where political risk used to be low, the situation isn't looking good at the moment. So for example, countries like Canada, Germany, France, Spain, they are without stable governments. In Canada, the prime minister has resigned a week or two ago. In Germany, the government collapsed in November. Early elections will take place in February. In France, the prime minister, who had only been in charge for a few weeks or a few months, he had to resign in December. new prime minister took over, but facing exactly the same challenges. Minority government. Spain, similar situation, minority government, they can't pass a budget. So even these once very stable countries from a political risk point of view, they are facing challenges. And then there are countries where there is a stable government in place, but that government is run by the far right or supported by the far right. Italy, Netherlands, Sweden, they are run by far right parties. And although as an economist, I'm politically neutral, for me, it doesn't matter who's governing a country, far right, far left, centrist, that's not important. However, it is important how these policies are impacting on businesses. And that's my job, to assess the business implication of political reforms. And quite often these measures that are brought in by non-mainstream parties are very difficult for companies to digest. So that is a big concern. When we look at the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, we can see that there is this massive spike now. Look at the right end of that chart. That's obviously caused by the re-election of Donald Trump. Especially Europe is endangered. The growth model is under threat. External security might not be provided by the US for much longer. So that is another source of concern. Free trade is endangered by new tariffs. There could be trade war, and especially Europe is very, very reliant on free trade. I will show you how important that is on one of the next slides. And then the ongoing trend of nearshoring and friendshoring that had started during COVID as a kind of a supply chain mitigating issue, that is now a political risk thing. Companies are enticed by their domestic government to source from closer to home, geographically, but also ideologically. So yeah, all of that is causing severe problems. Let's have a look at the exposure of the UK and the EU to the US, and let's start with the UK. I'm not telling you anything new here when I say that the US is super important for the UK in terms of international trade. The US is by far the most important export market, and it's also the most important import market for the UK. In 2023, the US took around 22% of all UK exports, and that is 3 times more than what Germany took. Germany was the second most important export market. So the US takes more than a fifth of all UK exports. And when we look at it from an imports perspective, around 13% of all UK imports originate in the US. The exposure to that, or to the US, is much bigger in the service sector. And keeping in mind that service sector accounts for 80% of British GDP, that is important. 27% of all service sector exports go to the US, and 20% of all service sector imports in the UK come from the US. If you add up all the exports, all the imports across goods and services between the US and the UK in 2023, you end up with a figure that is above 300 billion pounds. And generally, the UK sells more to the US than it buys from the US. The trade surplus amounts to more than 71 billion pounds, which makes the UK very vulnerable to the implementation of tariffs. There is one good thing, and we can see that when we look at the left-hand side, which shows the top 5 UK goods exports at the top chart, and the top 5 UK services exports, that's at the bottom. And you can see that service sector exports are much more important, much bigger. And implementing tariffs on service sector trade is much trickier than on goods sector trade. It doesn't mean that there are no measures in place, or the Trump or the American administration couldn't think about any measures that could harm the British service sector, but it's certainly a bit of a mitigating factor here. Let's have a look at the EU trade exposure to the US. Similar story here. The US is super important for the EU in terms of international trade as well. And that importance has actually gone up over the last 15 years or so. In 2010, the US took around 15%, 15% of all EU exports in 2010. In 2023, it took 20%, so a 5 percentage point increase. And it is also home, the US is home to 14% of all EU imports, which makes it the second most important import market for the EU. Only China is more important. China supplies 21% of all imports going into the EU. Exports to the US now account for 5% of EU GDP, but there's a massive gap between the countries, and we can see that on the chart on the left-hand side. Generally speaking, the EU runs a huge trade surplus in goods, sells more stuff to the US than it buys from the US, 170 billion euros trade surplus in goods. But then that is by a service trade deficit of around 100 million euros in 2023. There are countries like Ireland, Cyprus, Luxembourg that are more exposed. In these countries, exports to the US account for almost 20% in the case of Ireland, but then that is distorted by a huge financial sector exposure. In my eyes, countries like Belgium, Germany, they are much more exposed to potential tariffs as they trade or sell a lot of goods to the US. One thing to watch that could help the EU going forward are petrol imports coming from the US or shale gas. That has gone up over the past few years as the EU was phasing out Russian hydrocarbon imports. So the deal between the EU and the US could be that no tariffs or only small tariffs if the EU is willing to buy more natural gas and petrol coming out of the US, especially sectors like chemicals and pharmaceuticals, automotive. They are very exposed because they are the most important export products to the US. So let's have a quick look at supply chain stress that has risen as well over the past few months or quarters as well. The composite index has risen by around 30%. That is the Drewry World Container Index. So shipping goods from A to B on a global scale as a global average has risen by 30%. That's on top of 100% increase last month. So we've seen a rapid rise there. Not so much movement in the Shanghai to Rotterdam route, but there are other connections where shipping containers, 40-foot equivalent units, has become much more expensive, and that in turn is also having a negative impact on inflation rates, as obviously that is an input cost factor for companies. Before I move to the next chapter, let me invite you again to submit some questions. Please use the comments function on LinkedIn, and we will get to that once we have completed the credit risk assessment. Before we do that, let's have a quick look at interest rates. That is obviously to a certain degree connected to inflation rates. Inflation has come down very quickly over the past 2 years, and that has helped to create some room to maneuver for central banks. A lot of central banks around the globe, including the Fed, including the Bank of England, including the ECB, they have cut rates in 2024, and interest rates will continue to drop in 2025. However, there are some downside risks. A term that you can read very often at the moment when you read the Financial Times or The Economist is higher for longer. So a lot of experts, and including myself, to be honest, we expect that interest rates have to stay higher for a longer than initially expected period because inflation has proved stickier. And one thing that is also rather concerning is that interest rates, despite having come down, are still very, very high. And we can see that very nicely in that chart on the left-hand side. This shows interest rates on corporate loans in the Eurozone. If I had selected an UK indicator or indicators from somewhere else, it would have been exactly the same story. Interest rates have come down. Central banks have cut rates. Commercial banks have followed suit. But that moderation in interest rates is rather small compared with that very quick tightening in 2022 and 2023 as well. So interest rates are still as high as they were during the global financial crisis, for example. They're still much higher than 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So if you're rolling over debt that was taken out 5 years ago, you will still end up with a much higher interest rate bill. At the same time, it's not only interest rate costs that are worrying, it's also lending terms. Banks have tightened lending terms quite considerably over the last year or two. So getting access to credit is more costly than 2 years ago, and getting access to credit is more difficult than 2 years ago. And that is having a negative impact on credit risk. Before we look at insolvencies, let's have a look at B2B payments performance in Europe. This is data from Dun & Bradstreet. I've been looking at the data for 15 years now. I was with DNB for 11 years as a chief economist. And 4 years ago, I left to join Baker Ring. So I've been working with that data for 1.5 decades now. And normally there isn't a lot of movement in that data. And in fact, the positive news here is that B2B payments performance in Europe has actually improved in the third quarter of 2024. This is the latest available data point. The average payment delay in Europe stands at 11.9 days, and that's actually down from 12.1 days in the second quarter. The 11.9 days in Q3 is actually also the reading from Q1. So from Q1 to Q2, we saw a deterioration, but from Q2 to Q3, we saw an improvement. Positively, the UK is actually one of the best performing countries now. In the UK, delays dropped from 13 days in Q3 last year to now 11.2 days. So almost a 2-day improvement. UK companies, on average, or at least that's what the DNB database is showing, they are paying quicker now. As I said, I've been looking at the data for 15 years now, and there isn't a lot of movement. Netherlands and Germany pay quick. Italy and Portugal pay slow. Generally speaking, the Southern European countries are the slow-paying countries. But there is one country that has seen sizable deterioration since COVID. So over the past 5 years or so, France has slipped in that ranking quite considerably. In fact, payment delays in France since COVID have increased by 3 days, which is, again, fairly unusual. And that's also mirrored by our own data. So Baker Ring sees a lot of demand for its debt collection services in France. So if you're exposed to France and you're worried that you're not getting paid, you should certainly look into that in more detail and contact us if you need any advice and support. So let's have a look at insolvency risk. This is still a source of concern, especially on a continental European level, and that comes on top of a very, very worrying 2023. In 2023, global insolvencies were up by 12.5%, according to a Dun & Bradstreet report, and that increase was spread evenly across the continents. The US saw an 80% increase in business failures in 2023. India saw a 50% increase. Japan, 23%. In the EU, massive increase as well. Around 170,000 bankruptcies in the EU in 2023. France accounted for around a third of them, so overrepresented as well. And the worrying thing is that in the EU, figures are still rising. The latest available data point is for Q3. In Q3, a number of business failures in the EU increased by almost 7% year on year, and that's on top of a 22% increase year on year in the second quarter. So in the EU, figures are still rising. That's rather concerning. In England and Wales, the situation is slightly better, but we have to keep in mind that in 2023, number of business failures in England and Wales had reached a 40-year high when we look at it from absolute figures perspective. The latest available data points for November. In November, the number of business failures in England and Wales dropped by 12% year on year. We haven't seen the December value yet, so we can't say how business failures performed in 2024. But if we aggregate the January to November readings, we actually end up with a 4% drop in business failures. So while in continental Europe, in the EU, insolvencies are still going up, in England and Wales, the tide has turned and figures are actually dropping again, but they're dropping from a 30-year, 40-year high. For 2025, the outlook is slightly mixed, I'd say. On the one hand, interest rates are coming down. Growth should be a bit higher. That should help. But at the same time, you've seen interest rates. If you're rolling over medium and long-term debt, it's still a massive concern. Demand isn't particularly good. Growth is going up, but still anemic. Lending conditions are tight. So I'd expect some minor improvements. But credit risk will still be a sizable concern for businesses. Let me sum things up, and then we can move on to the Q&A session. So what are the key takeaways from today's event? And unfortunately, a lot of these takeaways will be rather negative. First of all, global growth in 2025 as well as 2026 will be roughly the same as in 2023 and 2024. You've seen the forecast around 3.5% global growth across these 4 years per annum. So that is rather disappointing because 3.2% growth in 2024 wasn't a very high figure. Global growth was much higher before COVID. It has moderated. So companies shouldn't expect too many tailwinds coming out of the economy. And we look at the Eurozone, the picture is even gloomier. The biggest economy is Germany. They are struggling. GDP fell in 2023, fell in 2024, and Germany is probably one of the most exposed countries to a trade war. So it is possible that real GDP in Germany will fall again in 2025. But France and Italy are also countries where growth won't be stellar. We're looking at around 1% growth in Italy as well as France. And especially France has some homemade political problems as well. They need to cut the fiscal deficit. That is a common theme across many countries. The cost for servicing government debt has also risen. The UK is facing super high interest rates on their government bonds. So that is rather boring because it limits the room to maneuver for governments. Let's have a look at Asia. China, second biggest economy globally, is also seeing some severe problems. Growth in China will moderate from 5.2% in 2023 to around 4.5% in 2025. And again, you need to keep in mind that the 2025 forecast from the IMF is from a time when Donald Trump wasn't elected. So given that China will likely be hit severely by tariffs, it could be that Chinese growth will be actually even weaker than the 4.5% that the IMF is currently forecasting. The positive aspect is inflation. Inflation has come down, is low. It's not at 2% yet, but it's not far away. But there are some reasons for why inflation is rather sticky at the moment, especially in the service sector. But nonetheless, central banks should be able to cut interest rates further in 2025. The impact on credit risk, however, won't be immediate. Interest rates will be falling, but you've seen from the chart when I showed you interest rate costs in the Eurozone that even if interest rates go down by another 25 or 50 or 75 basis points, we're nowhere near these record low interest rates that we've seen between 2009 and 2025. So especially in continental Europe, in the EU, a number of business failures is still a massive source of concern. Figures are still rising. In the UK, picture is slightly better. Number of business failures has fallen in the first 11 months of 2024. And once December data is out, we will probably see that the year as a whole has also seen an improvement, but that improvement will be on the back of a super high figure in 2023. Geopolitics, that's my last comment here, is also causing additional headwinds. The potential conflicts range from external security threats. In the worst case, the US withdraws from NATO or stops funding. And then the ongoing defragmentation of global trade flows, global trade war, reintroduction of tariffs. All of that is causing severe problems, especially for economies that are deeply integrated into global trade, such as the Netherlands, such as Germany. There are countries like Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic that might not trade with the US that much directly, but then they supply Germany. So there are these second round effects that are very worrying for these economies. So yeah, the year isn't starting on a high. I think that's a fair assessment. One last comment before we reach Q&A. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to submit them. I would like to encourage you to navigate to the Bakering homepage. There's a lot of free of charge content there waiting for you, ranging from macroeconomic political risk analysis to sectoral papers. We also have content that is dedicated to credit risk professionals. We have a credit hubs section where we host information about the legal environment in the country, for example. And as I said, everything is free of charge. I'd also like to encourage you to connect with Bakering on LinkedIn to stay informed about new releases of these reports. And if you haven't done so yet, feel free to send me an invite as well. So yeah, let's have a look at questions. And a few have come in already before the event. That was submitted by email. That's also something you could do for the next event, which will take place in mid-February. We stick to that Wednesday slot, that space. And yeah, let's start with the questions. Why is inflation higher for longer? Yeah, that's driven by several effects. First one is service sector inflation is sticky. As mentioned, in the service sector in the EU, inflation stands at around 4%. That's twice the target rate. Target rate's 2%. And goods inflation is around 0.5%. So service sector inflation is driving the overall inflation rate at the moment. That's not a surprise, because in the service sector, wage developments are much more important. Wages are a much higher cost component in the service sector normally, because not a lot of machinery is used, for example. And because wage growth is still fairly strong, service sector inflation is also very high. Another reason are energy prices. Energy prices have stopped falling. So over the past year or so, 2 years, energy prices have moved lower, and that helped to reduce inflation. That effect has stopped. So it's basically base effect. So ultimately inflation is stickier because of service sector inflation and because of energy prices not falling much further. And when you look at the oil forecast, for example, for 2025, I've seen some forecasts this year that basically don't expect a lot of movement. So we shouldn't expect a further drop in hydrocarbon prices. I hope that answered that question. The next question is around interest rates in the UK. in 2025. What will be the interest rate in the UK in 2025? Impossible to answer. The long answer is, well, let me approach it from this angle. Last year, the IMF visited the UK, and they issued a long report, the Article 4 consultation report. And in that report, they basically said the IMF recommended that interest rates in the UK should drop to 3.5% by the end of 2025. So there are two problems here. Obviously, the first one is that that report is now slightly out of date because it's a few months old, it's half a year old. And obviously, the UK might have been overtaken by economic and political development. Second problem is also that what the IMF wants is not necessarily what the Bank of England does, but it gives you a rough idea of how much room to maneuver there is for the Bank of England. Interest rates could fall by more than 1 percentage point until the end of 2025. We've seen an increase in inflation in the past 2 months, but now this morning we've actually seen some unexpected improvement. So today was certainly a good day for everyone who's considering taking out a loan, because the likelihood of an interest rate cut in the UK has certainly increased. So the last question that was submitted to me was, why is China having such a rough time? Well, where do I start? Well, there are several problems that the Chinese economy is facing at the moment. The first one is a more long-term problem, and that's demographics. China is getting older. It's getting older very quickly. That's a result of that one-child policy that they had until a decade ago. Birth rate in China is one of the lowest in the world. I think Chinese women have, on average, 1.1 children. That's super low. Obviously, you need 2 children to keep population stable. So there are more old people every year than there are young people, which isn't helping. China also has severe problems in its real estate sector. There were some bubbles that will take time to correct. Consumer confidence in China is also very low. We've seen consumer confidence on a global scale. I've shown you that increase. In China, unfortunately, this isn't happening yet. So given that China is a massive market, that is having some global ramifications as well. But generally speaking, Chinese consumers are fairly reluctant to spend. And then we've also seen something, and that's more coming from the political side. Over the past few years, there is more government interference into the business sector. So the state gets more involved in how private sector companies are run, and quite often that's having a negative effect on efficiency, on profits. So simply because the government wants to take more control, that is having some negative aspect or impact on the Chinese economic performance as well. So all in all, China is facing some problems as well. And as it is the world's second biggest economy, that is slowing down global growth as well. As said, if you want me to address questions, you can already send me one for the next Real Talk Economic event. It will take place in mid-February on a Wednesday. And as I've run out of questions, I might have answered all of your questions during my presentation. I would like to conclude today's event a few days early. I would like to thank you again for taking part in it, for showing that much interest in country risk. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me, either on LinkedIn or via email. That recording will be made available to you and potentially your colleagues on the Bakering homepage in the next few days. So you can repeat it if you want to look at some slides. The slides are made available to you as well if you want. And yeah, that's all I want to cover today in today's event. Thank you so much, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.